Hi, class. Welcome to mini lecture number 5 for film report 5, the apocalyptic myth. Just a couple of things in terms of terminology. The word apocalypse literally means an uncovering or a revelation, which is an element of what's referred to as eschatology, which is a part of theology that's concerned with the final events of history or the ultimate destiny of humankind. So the one is sort of a subcategory of the other, if you're going to use those in your those terms in your reports. Just looking over the film report, one thing to note is that there's an alternate film report number 5 that has a subtle difference in the film selections. So the first one, you get to choose between Noah, Night of the Living Dead, Blade Runner, and The Matrix. And the idea is to choose 2 of those and do sort of a compare contrast. And what you're doing there is each of those are apocalyptic films that are made to represent the cultural hegemony of a specific decade. So Noah of the 2010s, Night of the Living Dead for the 60s and early 70s, Blade Runner for the 80s, and The Matrix for the 90s. So you might compare how culture has changed and from the 60s to the 90s, and compare Matrix with the Night of the Living Dead, for example. So the other one asks you to one of the questions that's asked in this is to examine both the differences, but also you might discuss how some of the films also can be described as creation myths. And the other one allows you to kind of go into more depth on that analysis. One of the things we kind of give short shift to in this class is the creation myth. And here's where we can kind of bring that in. In many ways, both apocalyptic myths and creation myths are just 2 sides of the same coin. Apocalyptic myths deal with the unknown kind of after destruction, whereas creation myth is kind of the same. It's the unknown prior to the known, which was created in some way, and especially the circular pattern of death, resurrection, of destruction and creation, etc., is kind of a dialectic that goes together. So you might consider that. In the second one, the film that's added is Terrence McNally's The Tree of Life, which really isn't apocalyptic. It's more of a creation myth with elements of the apocalyptic. And so if you really want to focus on that, you might choose that alternate film report instead of the first one. Okay, so I'm going to try to be quick on this one. A few things in terms of old business. I see progress with every essay now. I think we really did good with number 3, and hopefully a lot of that is being carried over into number 4. I'm seeing some good things in the discussion, so forth. But let's make sure we go beyond describing the characters, and we use that description to say something about cultural hegemony. If the description of our male divine hero is this and this, well, that says something that it says that this and this, A and B, A, B, and C, which are characteristics of the hero, are also, that means also the A, B, and C are values or ideals of the current world we live in. Okay, and then the question is to ask why those ideals and not another. How do those ideals manage to not be threatening to cultural hegemony, whereas others might be? Let's continue to do that and try to do that with one overall general interpretation. And I think some of you are picking up on that and doing a much better job. So on this one, look at the readings on this. One thing you might look at closely is the stuff that I have on Baudrillard. There's quite a few readings on this, and the stuff on Baudrillard, it's all related to the Matrix, but I think it works as an example of how cultural hegemony and myth are interrelated quite well. His idea is this theory that he refers to as the hyperreal. Um, he argues that there's a different, what he calls an imaginary, that goes with different types of cultures. And he argues that the imaginary can be used to kind of maintain the status quo, any given social order. The first imaginary he describes as utopian. And in a utopian imaginary, the social order is maintained by alluding to a either future or just a better world outside of this one. And we can see this, say, in the Christian idea of heaven, right? So one way to maintain the social order is to say that what happens, no matter how much oppression and suffering you go through in this world, you'll be rewarded for it in the next. So we can certainly see how that can maintain a certain social order, right? And he suggests that another kind of way that that's done is through what he calls the Promethean or technological civilizations, and that presents what he refers to as the Promethean imaginary, where spaceships, robots, etc., are projected onto the culture as a way to kind of very similar to the utopian, but the utopia here is always in the future, this future world that's going to be created. And what he suggests, though, is that our current world order is maintained by neither of those two imaginaries, but primarily through something he refers to as the hyperreal. And the hyperreal is a new situation in which the implosion of imaginary and real create a hyperreal that takes the place of the real. So essentially, he argues that, for example, one of his ideas is that Disneyland, the whole point of Disneyland is to convince people that Los Angeles is real. In other words, to create this hyperreal um, that will make us believe that the world we actually live in is real when it's not. And film, he argues, is a great way to do this. In a certain sense, film, we identify more with the spectacle, with the hyper real, than we do with our actual lives. That we all see ourselves as a character and a protagonist in a film world, in a hyper real universe, as opposed to a real universe. The hyper fidelity tends to dominate historical details in such a way. So there's much more to that, and so be sure to read that article to get the specifics on that. And he applies it to the Matrix. Or no, I should say that the filmmakers applied his idea to the Matrix. Now, Baudrillard was still alive when that film was made, and he was critical of their efforts. And you can read about why. In a certain sense, they kind of understood. And within the universe of the film, I think you can see the hyper real at work. That the world of Neo is the spectacle, but the reality is they're all plugged into these machines that are producing this spectacle that everyone takes for the real. But he suggests that ultimately what the film does is it promotes this hyper real in that the film itself is such a spectacle, right? That it becomes a bigger that it becomes something we identify with more than the film. I'm trying to find the part to read. Here the technical capacities of the medium are the point. And the advertised star of the film and a technologically produced hyperrealism dominates its aesthetics as we linger scopophilacally upon the quality of the film and upon its look, upon the cyber noir tones, shades, and metals of the fashion and technology on display. So the film itself becomes a sort of techno chic object, techno chic object of consumption that we identify with in place of our actual lives in some way. So a different form of escapism is a kind of generalized way of saying that. And so, while it's applied to that film, I think it works in some others. And the other thing to look at in this film report is how human, and just as importantly, how non-human is defined in each of these films. So we can see the obvious, a zombie. The zombie is the non-human, but why? The computer as the non-human, the technological. So each of these films have an answer to that question that I think is worth exploring and will probably be um, a central part of all of your thesis statements. Um, so another one on this one is I've given you certain films, but our culture loves the apocalypse, right? And I think it's now more um, intriguing than ever because of the whole COVID thing. And so, one thing to explore in this paper as well is why? Why are we so infatuated with this idea of the apocalypse? Some ideas have been put forth that suggest that maybe we actually want an apocalypse. And in some ways, we can see that. You get a shopping spree every day. And in the same way we play video games, you get to blow up zombie heads or whatever. And then it's also been put forth that it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Another idea been put forth is that the apocalypse is empowering in some ways, that we all live in a world in which we're increasingly powerless. We can't see any way that we can really make any significant changes in society and so forth. Well, in the apocalypse, there's only 5 of you left or whatever. Suddenly, everything that you do matters. So maybe that's part of the fantasy, is because it gives us a sense of empowerment. So all those are questions that might be dealt with in this film report, as well as we use this as a lens into seeing cultural hegemony and to interpreting cultural hegemony. So that's all I can think of now. I'm going to try to keep it a little shorter and not to overwhelm you, and I'll save the rest of my thoughts about this topic for your presentations / rough drafts. It will follow the same routine as always. On Tuesday, your finals for film report 4 will be due. I've been cutting most of you some slack on that. I'm not that concerned about those, especially as we've gone remote. I'm not holding you to that date. But I have kind of put that out there because if I told you earlier that I'm not holding you to that date, my guess is that some of you would delay to the point where you have 2 weeks of pure hell when you're trying to do it all at once. But most of you are caught up at this point, so I'm not that concerned if you miss the deadline a little bit. As long as I get that, I won't deduct any points. It is important, though, because we can't have good conversations, you can't get good feedback on your presentations and rough drafts unless we hold to those due days. So make sure you're holding to those. And if you need some extra time on the others, feel free to do so. And as I mentioned, remember, you can redo these. And I know a couple of you have already done so. And most of you, I think, have reached the stage where you're qualified to redo them. In other words, that you're getting better, not worse. And so now that you kind of have a better idea of what I'm looking for, is a good time to kind of go back and do that. So we'll do this, and then we'll do next week, we'll do number 6. That one's a little, well, I'll talk about that one next week, but there's not as much that goes into that one. So I think that's a little easier for students. And then we'll use the remaining time to just work on our redos and so forth. So hopefully you'll have some time for that. As always, shoot me an email using the CCD, the email that's on the syllabus, if you have any questions, and hope you're all well. And until I'll see you on the next film report. Thanks.